The Smithsonian Faculty Fellowship Program represents a rewarding academic professional development opportunity for faculty at Montgomery College. The fellowships are a product of a unique collaboration between Montgomery College and the Smithsonian Center for Learning and Digital Access. It's the first of its kind between the Smithsonian Institution and a community college.
J. Sean Fay received a J.D. from Thomas M. Cooley Law School, an M.A. in Criminology and Criminal Justice from the University of Maryland, and a B.S. in Criminal Justice from Marist College. Prior to attending law school, Professor Fay worked in law enforcement as a police officer and a probation and parole agent in South Carolina. Professor Fay served as a full-time professor at Prince George's Community College before coming to Montgomery College in 2008. He currently teaches the Administration of Justice, Introduction to Law Enforcement, Criminal Law, and Constitutional Law courses. Professor Fay is licensed to practice law in Maryland and the District of Columbia.
Just wanted to start off saying I know everyone's going to say social justice is the most important to their topic, but I think in criminal justice, social justice, especially in today's day, is very important. So as I mentioned, as a former police officer and probation parole agent, social justice, I think, is key to any of our courses that we teach here at Montgomery College. And shortly before the application process for the Smithsonian Fellowship, I had taken a group of students to see one of the local law enforcement agencies. And at that presentation, the chief had mentioned that he could teach officers pretty much anything they needed to know in terms of law, in terms of how to drive a car, shoot a gun. But the thing he was really looking for in hiring individuals was he was looking for people with good character and those that had the ability to be empathetic to the needs of others. And I thought that was very important. And, after that, I was thinking, and as a professor, I have the ability to expose students to those things. And the Smithsonian opportunity emphasized an out-of-classroom experience that gave us that opportunity, so I thank you. So we started off the course, and this was in my introductory Administration of Justice course. It's our CCJS 110 course. And we started with, on the very first day, trying to define what both I and the students meant by social justice. And we came up with two kind of views in terms of social justice is the concept that all people should be treated fairly in our society. And we talked about particularly in terms of groups, in terms of race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, religion, sexual orientation, and how sometimes the law does not treat everyone equitably under those areas. And the students also mentioned, and I think especially in an educational institution, this was very important to them, that as a society we need to strive to improve access to educational and professional opportunities so that people have the ability to improve themselves as well as those around them. So throughout the semester, as we went through subjects, so in our course, we kind of go through, we start off with general constitutional premises. We look at laws, how laws are formed, then we move into law enforcement, into the courts, as well as corrections. And so we talked about that every criminal justice practitioner, no matter what their role is, has something to do with both social justice and procedural justice. It moves on from their ability to impact legislation. And we even talk about students, their ability to vote, and how some of them don't exercise that, and how important that is in terms of who our politicians are that represent our views. We talked about even the individual officer who stops someone on the side of the road and deals with them, and how they deal with them, and how social justice plays into that, all the way up through sentencing. And we talked about the fact that I want every one of our students that walk out of our program to have that embedded in their minds. So when they do go on into the field to be criminal justice practitioners, they have that. So for our course, we have a semester-long writing assignment, and it's consisted of 4 parts. The first thing that we did is we looked at an article, Thin Blue Lies, How Pretextual Stops Undermine Police Legitimacy by Jonathan Blank. And in that article, they talk about how pretextual stops the U.S. Supreme Court has legitimized. They've said that they are allowed, right? That they clearly look at the objective intention of the officer in stopping someone. But we talked about how stop and frisk policies may have impacted certain communities, especially lower socioeconomic communities and minority communities, and how that has the ability to ostracize those communities. And so after that, the students went on and looked at different community policing programs and problem-solving programs, and they created their own annotated bibliographies. We also incorporated where the students completed the Smithsonian Museum visit and developed a reflective paper, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then the final part of the project is where they complete their final paper, and they specifically address the issues of how can these programs reduce crime rates as well as improve community relations with police. So for preparing for our visit, I actually had the students complete 2 assignments in the Smithsonian Learning Lab. And we addressed 2 different topics. I'm only have time to really talk about one of them, but we looked at historic tensions between the police and African American communities, as well as treaty agreements between the United States and the American Indian nations. So to give you an example, there were a number of photos that the students were asked to look at. These are a sample of them, some of them more historic than others, and some of them dealing with some more current events that the students could relate to. After the students had the opportunity to go through these, they were asked a series of questions. So in the first Smithsonian Learning Lab that we did, they were asked, how has the historic tensions and mistrust amongst African American communities and the police undermined the perceived legitimacy of law enforcement in American society? And then the students were asked to define their own personal concepts of social justice and discuss how the treatment of minority groups in the United States may impact their belief in true social justice. And just to give you an idea, it was interesting. As I said, this is something that I really want them to have a understanding of before they go out into the workforce. And so each of the students had the opportunity to define it for themselves. What did it mean to them? And so my favorite one, I think, and I think because I was a police officer, that was kind of mine, was, to me, social justice is standing up for the oppressed, standing up for those that may not get the same opportunities as others. And hopefully the people that are going out and working in our field in terms of criminal justice have that mindset. On October 21st, I took 25 students down to the 2 museums. I actually, if I had to do it over, I think I would have broken it up, but they hung in there. So the first museum we went to was the National Museum of American History, and we looked at 3 different exhibits. I actually took them to American democracy, and then I gave them the opportunity to kind of have some free time and go through the museum. I requested that they go to Righting a Wrong, Japanese Americans in World War II, and the Greensboro lunch counter. And then we took a break, we had a lunch period, and then we went over to the National Museum of the American Indian, and they looked at the Nations to Nations treaties between the United States and American Indian nations exhibit. I'd actually taken a survey of my students during that period of time, and only 14 of the 25 had ever been to a Smithsonian. And I grew up in New York, so for me that wasn't, but I was just surprised that most of them were raised here locally, and they just hadn't had the opportunity to go down. And most of those that had attended, if they had attended, was the National Air and Space Museum. So that must be their. The one thing down in the lower corner there, when I went over to as I said, I gave them some free time, and when I went over to the Greensboro lunch counter, there's a couple student-led opportunities there, and there's the table there where you basically spin a dial and it comes up with a concept like freedom or justice. And everybody in the group, all 4 students, have the same exact pictures. And they have to lay down their pictures and explain why that means justice or why that means freedom. And I walked around the corner, and they were playing this for a while, and they were going through, they were like, oh, you come over, you sit down, you play. And I actually sat with them. So it was a really neat, nothing that I had envisioned for them, but something that was very meaningful to them. Each student, after we did the visit, they provided a reflection paper associated with the visit. And they were asked, after reflecting on the issue of social justice, they were asked to evaluate how historical events represented in the various museum collections led to a potential sense of mistrust of government institutions, and how that could impact you as a future criminal justice practitioner. When you go out in the field and deal with people, how might that impact you? And then students were also asked to identify 2 key historical events or collection pieces from the museum tour that personally caused them to evaluate or question the existence of social justice in either a social, legal, economic, and/or political structure of our nation. So, depending upon their individual interests, they came up with a various, I think American democracy, because I had kind of led them through that, we had a lot more interest in some of the things there. But slavery of African Americans, Jim Crow laws, Ku Klux Klan display that was there, the Martin Luther King Jr. display regarding nonviolent protests, and then voting right limitations, both for women, minorities, and by age, were big issues that they are big topics that they brought up in their papers. A number of the students highlighted the Greensboro lunch counter and righting a wrong because they didn't really have that much exposure to those, and so I think that those were more meaningful to them because they just didn't ever have the opportunity to see that before. And then Nations to Nations, that was kind of the last part of our day, and we didn't have quite as much of this, or the students write about them, but they talked about the historical struggles and betrayals that the American Indians had faced in terms of the enforcement of the treaty agreements along the way. So my students overall had a wonderful experience, both for myself. I learned some things from my students along the way. It was a great social opportunity for them because they enjoyed interacting with. Some of them had lunch groups and had interacted with people that they normally wouldn't have interacted with in school. I did poll my students, and they requested that I incorporate the Smithsonian project in future courses. And so on behalf of them and me, I'd like to thank you for both the Montgomery College staff as well as the Smithsonian staff for allowing this project to go on.